What's up, Yichi here. In this video, we're gonna talk about how we can figure out how much a home is really worth. Let's jump right in. During the home buying process, we often see homes that are priced sort of inconsistently. Now, how do we know exactly how much to pay and exactly how much a home is worth? Well, the answer to that question is both part art and part science. We'll use this home as an example, a one-bedroom condo in Richmond Hill listed for $580,000. Now, the best way to value something similar to a stock is to look at comparables. So the first thing we can do is look at similar units in that location that have sold recently. In this example, we can see a similar one bedroom sold for $490,000. This unit is very similar, but the only difference is the view is not nearly as nice. Now, this second one sold for $518,000 and has a much better view, but if you actually take a look closely at the photos, the hallway in the entry of the condo is super narrow and the bedroom has no door, it's just glass. So it's kind of like a studio as opposed to a one bedroom. So it's a much lesser unit than the one we're looking to buy. And yet this one still sold for $518K. So right away, we know that the bottom threshold of this house should be $528,000 because someone else was willing to pay that for a lesser unit than the one we're looking at. Now let's take a look at the upper threshold. Let's take a look at some better units that have sold. Here's one for $552,000. It's a better unit as it is much bigger in the kitchen area. Unit 714 also sold for $560K, but it has a huge 215 square foot terrace. Now there's no photos of this unit on MLS, but after some digging, the interior is pretty much identical to the home that we're looking at. Now here's another unit that is a 1+1 that has also sold for $560,000. Now, both of these units that have sold for $560,000 also have a locker, which is probably worth around $4,000 to $5,000. So with that in mind, we can safely say that the upper threshold for our house is around $550K because both of those units had lockers and sold for $560,000. So we're looking at $555,000, and one had a huge 200 square foot terrace and one had a den, both of which are worth at least $10,000, $15,000. But on the conservative side, let's say it's worth $5K. So we're looking at a range of $528,000 to $550,000. Now, the part that we just looked at is the science. It's actually quite easy to do. It's not like valuing a stock where we're looking at different ratios or things like that. A condo is a condo, it's just a box in the sky. So comparing things is relatively easy. But as you can tell, maybe it's not that easy since there's still a $20K gap in the price. This is where the art comes in. This is where the negotiations come in and where we have to play ball. Now, put yourself in the shoes of the seller. There are two examples of the situations that a seller could be going through. Example number one, the seller who owns this condo and is selling is bleeding on their mortgage. They just bought the home 2 years ago at a really high price, and now they've had to refinance their mortgage at a much higher rate. They can't afford this place anymore and they have debt. They need to sell. They're not going to tell you, but between them and their realtor, they could probably let this go for $499, let's say. They are very motivated to sell. Option two is this seller has many properties and they bought this home, 5 years ago for $200,000, and the interest rate doesn't really affect them that much. They can afford to wait and their bottom line is much, much higher. Again, we'll never really know because their agent has to provide confidentiality and privacy when in negotiations. However, as realtors, we have access to a database that can show every change in ownership and the dollar value and when it happened for that home. So when we're looking at homes like this, we can see when the last transaction was. For the sake of privacy, I will leave that alone for this video, but it is either going to be example 1 or example 2 as previously mentioned from the seller's perspective. From a buyer's perspective, we kind of have a hard cap, right? Because we've been pre-approved by the bank up to a certain amount. And yeah, maybe we can get a gift from family or things like that, but more or less the buyer also has a cap, and that cap must be kept private for negotiations from the cooperating salesperson. So as you can see, both the seller and buyer have different motivations, and the art is sort of finding the middle ground. Anything below that buyer's pre-approval is up to the buyer. We obviously don't want buyer's remorse. We don't want to overpay for a unit, but we also don't want to lose out on a home that we ultimately want. And at the end of the day, how much something is worth is how much someone is willing to pay. Finally, the market has to be taken into consideration. Today, because of the foreign buyer ban, higher interest rates, and a 9% stress test on mortgages, the amount of sellers has increased and the amount of buyers has decreased, which means it is a buyer's market and buyers have more leverage because sellers just aren't getting as many offers. So that can be an important chip to play when negotiating. Now, rewind a few years during COVID when interest rates were at 2%, when anybody could basically qualify for a loan. Well, sellers had the advantage because every home had multiple offers, so the seller's bottom line could probably be reached, right? They don't have to come down as much. So this is also an important factor to consider. And there's an annual part, right? 2020 is very unique compared to 2023, but also within each year, seasonality also is another sort of factor that needs to be taken into consideration. You're gonna get less offers during the winter. People don't really wanna move, and you're gonna get more eyes on your property in the summer. So both of those things have to be taken into consideration during the negotiation process. And everything that I mentioned with the market and with the buyer's bottom line and the seller situation, all of these are qualitative factors. They can't really be quantified, right? Because home buying at the end of the day is an emotional process. If your bottom line is $550, but someone offers you $549, are you really gonna say no? So that's sort of the art into this. It is an emotional decision. As you can see, buying a home is both an art and a science. Whereas if we take a look at another asset example, such as Apple stock, while different analysts might see Apple performing differently over time, which will affect the current price of Apple stock, however, the market will give you a definitive price at a certain time for an Apple stock to the penny. So it's much more of a science. We have an exact price that the buyer is willing to buy. Now, markets do close and there is a time gap between when you put in your buy or sell order and when it gets filled by the market. But because Apple is bought and sold thousands, if not millions of times a day, the gap between your buy and sell order and the actual price that you get it for is going to be very, very small. So that's why with an Apple stock, the valuation is almost purely science. It is precise. You know exactly to the dollar and to the cent how much you're going to pay to buy or sell that stock. Now, you can't measure the price of a home with the same level of precision. The gap is going to be much bigger with a house because it's only going to be bought and sold that one time. And buyers and sellers have unique factors coming in. Now, for example, a buyer going in might say, my bottom line is 600. But then they see a house they absolutely love, they love the neighborhood, and they're able to actually go above their bottom line because they're emotionally invested in a house, or because other buyers are coming in and there's multiple offers and they don't really want to lose the house. So we have a gap difference in the buy side. Now, same thing with the seller. Maybe they change their mind and they don't want to sell the house because they're emotionally involved in the house. Or maybe they're packing up their bags and they're leaving the country and they need to desperately sell the house. So you don't have those qualitative factors when buying stock, and you do when you have buyers and sellers coming together with real estate, which is why There's always a negotiation game to be played when buying and selling real estate. It is both a science and an art. Ultimately, quantitative and qualitative factors must be taken into consideration when buying real estate. You can definitely get a range in terms of how much objectively that house is worth, but at the end of the day, it is worth exactly how much someone is willing to pay for it. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it helped. We'll see you next time.